Officer Daniel Hayes froze in place, his gun trembling in his hand. The acrid smell of gunpowder hung in the air. On the manicured lawn before him lay a lifeless young boy, his blood pooling and soaking into the pristine grass. The boy's wide, unseeing eyes stared blankly at the night sky. In one hand, he had clutched a basketball, a mundane object turned tragic under the circumstances. The gated community was eerily quiet, broken only by the soft chirp of distant crickets. Porch lights flickered on, one after another, as curious and frightened neighbors peered out from behind curtains. Hayes' heart raced. The faint sound of sirens grew louder. He had only meant to fire a warning shot. His voice cracked as he muttered to himself. He shouldn't have been here. He shouldn't have run. His gaze darted to the black sedan that pulled up moments later. A tall man in a dark suit stepped out, his demeanor immediately commanding attention. Judge Lionel Carter, renowned for his unflinching pursuit of justice, stepped forward. His expression shifted from confusion to pure horror as his eyes landed on the boy. Sprinting forward, Judge Carter knelt beside the child, his trembling hands hovering as though afraid to touch the small body, as if doing so would solidify the nightmare. "No, Marcus, no," the judge cried, his voice breaking. The siren's wail crescendoed, and flashing red and blue lights painted the scene. Hayes' knees buckled under the weight of realization. The boy he had shot was the son of the most powerful and respected judge in the state. Judge Carter's tear-streaked face turned toward him, his voice a low growl. "You will pay for this." The day had begun like any other for Officer Hayes. Sitting in his patrol car, he had been sipping coffee and scrolling through his phone when a call came in. A report of trespassing in a gated neighborhood. The caller described a suspicious-looking black teenager wandering around. Hayes had rolled his eyes. Calls like these were routine. They rarely amounted to anything serious. Marcus Carter, Judge Carter's 13-year-old son, wasn't trespassing. He had been playing basketball at the community court when his ball rolled beyond the fence. He chased after it, unaware he had stepped onto private property. Hypervigilant neighbors immediately reported him. Marcus was an ordinary kid. He loved basketball, comic books, and pestering his older sister. That evening, he had promised to be home by 7 p.m. for family dinner. He never made it. When Hayes arrived, Marcus was already walking back to the court, holding his ball. Hayes stepped out of his car, one hand resting on his holstered weapon. "Hey, stop right there," Hayes shouted. Marcus froze, unsure of what he had done wrong. "I was just," Marcus started, but Hayes interrupted, his voice sharp. "Hands up." Marcus hesitated, fear paralyzing him. He dropped the ball and raised his trembling hands. Hayes' adrenaline surged. His assumptions clouded his judgment. The boy's hoodie, his hesitation, to Hayes. It all seemed suspicious. When Marcus instinctively took a step back, Hayes' training and biases collided disastrously. He drew his weapon. "I said stop," he barked. Panicking, Marcus turned to run. Hayes' pulse thundered in his ears. In a split second, he fired. Earlier that evening, Lionel Carter had been in his study, reviewing case files. His wife, Eleanor, was preparing dinner, and their daughter, Lily, was upstairs video chatting with friends. Marcus had been running late, but Judge Carter wasn't concerned. He trusted his son and their neighborhood. That illusion shattered when the phone rang. A neighbor's shaky voice informed him of an incident near the basketball court. Carter drove over immediately, expecting a minor accident. Instead, he found his son's lifeless body. As medics arrived, Hayes stood to the side, his mind spinning. This wasn't supposed to happen. It was just a kid. Judge Carter didn't care about Hayes' turmoil. All he cared about was his son, whose dreams of becoming an engineer were now gone. The arriving officers tried to manage the scene. One pulled Hayes aside. "Just keep quiet for now," they advised. "We'll sort this out." But Judge Carter wasn't planning to let anything be sorted out. He clenched his fists, seething with a rage he had never felt before. His voice broke the tense silence. "You'll face me in court, Officer Hayes, and I'll make sure you never forget my son's name." The next morning, news of the shooting dominated headlines. Unarmed black teen killed by officer in gated community. One headline read. Protests formed outside the police station. Crowds held signs demanding justice for Marcus. Inside, Hayes watched the news from a holding cell. His pale face reflected the crushing weight of his actions. Captain Rogers visited him that afternoon. "This is bad," Rogers said bluntly. "Real bad. You shot an unarmed child. And not just any child, Judge Carter's son. The press is all over this. You're going to be arrested." Hayes, there's no way around it. At the Carter household, grief hung like a suffocating cloud. Eleanor clutched Marcus' hoodie. Inhaling the faint scent of her son, Lily sat silently, staring at the floor. Judge Carter paced, his hands trembling not from fear but from anger. "This happened because of who he was," he said, his voice hard. "Because he was black in a neighborhood where they think we don't belong." Eleanor sobbed. "He was just a boy," she whispered. "He had so much ahead of him." Lionel knelt before her, taking her hands. "I'll make sure Daniel Hayes pays for this," he vowed. "He'll go to prison for the rest of his life if it's the last thing I do." The trial began amidst a media frenzy. The courtroom was packed, every seat taken. Hayes sat at the defense table, pale and trembling. Across the room, Judge Carter sat with an unyielding posture, his expression one of cold resolve. Beside him, Sarah Dean, the lead prosecutor, organized her files. Marcus Carter was 13 years old. Sarah began her opening statement. "He was unarmed. He was innocent. And he is dead because Officer Hayes saw him not as a child, but as a threat." The defense argued that Hayes had made a split-second decision under pressure. A tragic mistake, but not murder. Officers face dangerous situations every day, the defense attorney said. Hayes acted out of fear for his safety. The trial's turning point came when unaltered security footage was introduced. It showed Marcus walking away with his hands raised, his basketball tucked under his arm. The courtroom gasped as the footage froze on the moment Hayes fired. Tears streamed down Eleanor's face as Lionel clenched his fists. Sarah's voice was steady but piercing. "This is not the behavior of someone protecting and serving. This is recklessness. This is bias." The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning their verdict. "We find the defendant, Officer Daniel Hayes, guilty of second-degree murder." The courtroom erupted. Some wept with relief, others with anger. Lionel Carter held Eleanor tightly as tears streamed down his face. Justice had been served, but the cost was immeasurable. In the weeks that followed, the Carters channeled their grief into action. They founded Marcus Light, an organization advocating for police accountability. Their fight became a national movement, sparking legislative reform and inspiring countless families. One evening, Lionel stood before a mural of Marcus, his son's smiling face painted against a backdrop of stars. He placed a